You listen to this podcast because you like books, or maybe because you like learning, or maybe you just like the sound of my voice lulling you to sleep. If it's the first two, Audible has you covered. Too busy to read? Driving and don't want to run into another dog? Audible is a huge library of audiobooks where people read to you like you're a kid again. And guess what? You can try it out for free. Just go to readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to sign up for your free trial today.
The whole universe has sort of evolved. Your whole life has evolved, and man has evolved, and society's evolved, and the idea of drawing has evolved from all these histories. And so you can just kind of let go and just let this thing draw, let it draw. What's coming out is really the natural course of all the things that have brought it to be.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 14. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with John Simon about his book, Drawing Your Own Path, 33 Practices at the Crossroads of Art and Meditation. John F. Simon Jr. is a visual artist and author of Drawing Your Own Path, released in 2016 by Parallax Press. As one of the pioneers in the development of software art, his seminal work, Every Icon, was included in the 2000 Whitney Biennial, and his art appliances can be found in the permanent collections of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, among others. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, hello and welcome everyone to Read, Learn, Live. I am here today with John F. Simon Jr., author of Drawing Your Own Path, 33 Practices at the Crossroads of Art and Meditation. I'm really excited because this book was fascinating and interesting, and I got to do lots of fun exercises at the same time. Say hello to everyone, John.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. So I always like to start off with just asking the author just to kind of summarize the book in their own words.
Yeah, the book is a collection of stories, lessons, and practices that I accumulated over 16 or 17 years of daily drawing practice. And it allows me to share some of the insights and experiences that I had and to provide the methods that if other people want to take up or try that practice, there's some very easy ways to start.
Great. And so I always like to ask a couple questions about the writing process before we jump into the book itself, because this is a very interesting book in and of itself, just the structure and what you did with it. So I like to start off with asking why you decided to write this particular book. You know, there's lots of different. You could have done lots of different drawing books. You could have done meditation books. You wrote a very specific type of book in a very specific way. So why was that calling to you?
Yeah, it was more a collaboration with the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing my drawing kind of innocently for many years when I started to have some kind of awakenings, openings, path moments. And I didn't know what they were, and I went in to try to figure it out, and I discovered that what I was doing was a kind of meditation, the way I was drawing and the way I was holding my attention. I worked with the teachers, specifically Vincent and Emily Horn, who were calling themselves then the Buddhist Geeks. And we worked together to try to figure out where the crossroads were between the art practice and the meditation practice. And they had a conference in Boulder, and at the conference was a number of booksellers and publishers. And one of the publishers, Parallax Press, was there, and Nancy Fish went to my workshop and sat through my talk, and at the end asked me to send some materials in, said they would like to see some materials, that she liked the workshop. And so it hadn't occurred to me to put it out as a book until then, but then I saw that Parallax, who had been publishing Thich Nhat Hanh's books, they're his press, and they were starting to publish a wider variety of books that would incorporate mindfulness in all sort of aspects of life, which is kind of becoming a little bit of a trend. mindfulness in finance, mindfulness in athletics, and so they had the idea that mindfulness in creative practice would be an interesting thing, and I was seeing my creative practice open into mindfulness. So that seemed to be the right way to position the book for the press that was asking for it and for the path that I was following. So it was nicely unfolded in front of me.
Yeah, that sounds great. So once you started writing the book, what was your process like? What was your day to day?
I tried to sit down and write about 1,000 words a day. That was was sort of my goal, to really not to belabor it. I wrote an outline and a couple of sample chapters for their proposal process, and that kind of got the format started. And I really tried to make a summary. It really is a summary book of a long term practice and a lot of ideas that I had. So probably there's more to be done. And actually, when I'm teaching it now, I'm finding each chapter I can open up into much more information. But I really just wanted to get down all the steps of the process and understand it myself, because it's more than just a one-shot thing. There's the making of the drawings, there's the reading of the drawings, and there's sort of all sorts of daily practice, and then getting the drawings out there. So yeah, I sat down and tried to figure out what stories were appropriate for the messages I was trying to convey, and what practices were appropriate. That took a lot of time, basically just sitting and thinking, and then pounding the keyboard, sometimes in the Julia Cameron artist way method of just writing whatever came up and kind of journaling it out.
Yeah.
And so I end up making many more words than I use, but in journaling it out and just brainstorming it out, I would, that's the story, that's the memory, that's the thing, and then I would um, just write that out as best I could. And I got from maybe June to September, I put together about 50,000 words. And then we spent maybe 6 more months editing that,
Yeah.
and several months picking out the drawings and things and matching them up. So yeah, writing it was just getting the raw words out there was the pretty straightforward part of the process. And then the editing
Yeah.
took a lot longer.
Yeah. Was there anything that particularly surprised you while you were writing? Maybe like an insight you had that you hadn't thought of before?
There were many. There were many. A lot of times, what I thought would be a big discussion turned out to be summarized very quickly. And other times, something that seemed so obvious, I could never get down in words and took a long time to sort of describe. And I do wish that I had spent more time opening up and describing some of the personal experiences, but I think it would have made the book, maybe the book would have been too big at that point. I don't know. But it surprised me what opened up and what closed down. That was probably the biggest surprise. And also when I got into the theory, which is more or less at the end on chapter 6 and outside of the practical methods, also that was really much larger than I thought. And so I spent what time I could on it, but I had to, at that point, go back and really, I don't know what you'd say. I had to professionalize. I had to make rigorous the practice. So something that was naturally occurring to me, the creative process, to try and put some limits on, I had to really understand at a deeper level. So that surprised me, and I did spend the time to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely something about actually teaching something to other people or getting something across that you have to really understand it even more than you already did.
It's very true, and to write it down and put your name on it, and that's going to be the mark in time, it's
Right.
daunting, and I can see why book projects get stalled. And this stalled out many. I quit this many times before I finished it. It's daunting, and somehow there's a lot of constriction when you think this is it. This is the one. This is the book I'm writing. This is my book or something. It becomes very tight.
Yeah.
And I had to practice what I preached. I had to use my creative methods, and I had to use my creative practices and my mindfulness practices to open it up and make it flow again. And so I was really tested in that way, and that was fun.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned this a little bit, but yeah, the book really is interesting. It's set up in an interesting way because you have your practices and you get the reader to actually do things and to draw and meditate, but you also talk about yourself a lot, and it's almost a memoir in that sense. I feel like of what your life has been up to now, and so you alternate back and forth between that. And how did you decide on that format and how much weight to give in the book to the practices versus your life?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're right. It is part memoir and part practice instruction. And I've read many books, spiritual practice books and art books that delve a lot into theory or that delve a lot into technique. But I find when I'm ready to relax and read, what I'm reading a lot of are stories, and I think
Mm,
stories are really powerful. And I also
right.
think so I think that's a way to engage a reader is to tell stories, but it's also a way to show that your experience supports the kind of things that you're teaching. So I wanted to show that I'd been through an art school in Italy, or I'd been through some sort of emotional experiences that I was drawing from to say what I had to say. So I wanted to both be engaging and I wanted to sort of back up the theory and give some ground to the practices. And I thought it'd make a very kind of nice flow in the book. So, and I did try to make it sort of 1/3 each, roughly. I would tell the
Hmm.
story, and then I would tell the lesson, and then I would give the practice. And I think they all support in each section what sort of the central theme of what that one's about.
That makes
And so,
sense.
yeah, and some people learn differently. Some people learn kinesthetically, and some people learn visually, and some people learn, better through stories. So I wanted to try to make it as approachable from all the directions that I could.
Yeah, well, that's great. So last question before we jump to the book itself. But in the introduction, you wrote a sentence I really liked, which was doing creative work every day is what's important, not the style you choose. So it sounded like a really good life philosophy. So tell me how you got there and why that's so important.
I got there by doing it every day.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many times we think like I do this, or I have to. I'm too busy to do what I want because I'm doing this, and we get very focused on an identity or a goal, um, or a purpose, or we just have. When focus is good, don't get me wrong, it's good. Can't get things done without focus, but and then we tend to discount those moments when you just let go of that and turn away from that. And I think that those are really important. And I think that's where, our lives are richer. But I also think that's a really healthy thing because I think that when we're moving quickly through the day, we suppress a lot of things. Something comes up in the mind. I got to think about that later, and maybe we don't, maybe we do. And so
Mm,
just taking a moment, whether it's a meditative moment or a creative moment, to just turn the light around and sit and relax and just let that stuff come up. Just allow, because there's stuff that won't come up unless you clear out the must do this, must do that list that's always there, and just put
sure.
that aside. So I really think just taking a moment of the day, and the creative moment's a really good place to do it because when you're engaged in the physicality and the visual feedback of the drawing process, you're not suppressing those things, and they tend to pop up. So
Hmm.
it's not like I say it's like flossing, like just a little creative flossing every day, just to let find out what it is that's just that kind of sitting in the background, ready to pop up. Let it
Mm,
out. There's this is we'll get into that when we get into the book, but there's a lot of fear comes up. There's a lot of hesitation. People don't want to do creative work sometimes because they think that what they do won't be good, but it's also because they're afraid of what will come up. They're afraid of what it will look like. So uh, but it's healthy. I guess that's the point of that is that we if once we learn to allow that, it's a very healthy thing. And we end up with you end up with a diary and a record of that, and that you'll see over the long term is also a really good thing to have.
yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, yeah, that nicely catapults us into the book itself. And you've got sort of 7 different chapters. And so I've got some questions based on each. So that your first chapter is wrong question, right answer. And so maybe just start off by telling us the story of how your research led to you asking the wrong question, but you ended up with the right answer and ended up,
Okay.
doing your self-inquiry meditation.
I call myself sometimes an accidental meditator because I was the last person who would have like bought into the value of just sitting quietly in a chair every day. For example, it seemed all too like spiritual stuff seemed too far out there, and I was
Hmm.
had been working in science, and even when I was an artist, I was doing more or less computer art, software art. So I started out trying to write a computer program that would do artificial intelligence as an artist, like a creative AI. So I had in mind to write a program that would create art itself, and I used all the sort of regular methods of computer science, technical methods. So algorithms for artificial life and for emergent behavior and for self-organizing systems and all sort of, at that time, this was in the mid 90s. At that time, genetic algorithms were there as well. And I did projects that were using those algorithmic techniques that were designed to create novelty or to invent things. And I found a lot of limits to that. I found out that the creator of those algorithms couldn't separate themselves from the algorithms. In other words, if you made an algorithm to make a certain kind of art or a certain filter, they were Photoshop filters that would make pen and ink drawings, but they really reflected the programmer's idea of what a pen and ink drawing looked like, because there were so many ways to do it. Just like if you make a pen and ink drawing and I make a pen and ink drawing, they're going to look different.
Right.
And so the Photoshop filter should also have that quality, but they didn't. Those algorithmic techniques only had the quality of the artistic decisions that the programmer made. So how do you get away from that? Because then I thought, well, I feel like I do that. I feel like I express myself. So instead of trying to make the computer solve the problem of being creative, could I just study my own creativity? Could I just somehow look at my own unspoken rules and then discern those rules and put those rules into the computer? That seemed like a expert system plan. There was so I would write an expert system to be a creative AI. And so in order to do that, I sat down in the studio with a pencil and paper, and I just started to improvise whatever came up. I sort of made a day. I got the card, I got the pencil, I sat down and I started to draw. And I would draw a horizontal line, and then maybe I'd make a curly line, and then I'd make a couple of vertical lines, what have you, whatever came up. But at the time it was happening, I would ask myself, why is it that I did that? I would improvise as everybody just sort of doodles and sort of watches their hand and does what they like. Why is it I like that? Why am I doing that? So I thought that I would get to a singular source. Thought I would get to a place where I could understand why those decisions were coming up. But what happened was, as I got further and further back into examining where they were coming up, I found that, and this is over months and years of practice, I found that I might be making the horizontal line because I was starting out in a hurry, and then the curly line because I got bored, and then the vertical lines because I was getting cold in the studio. And then it was coming from everywhere. The influences were coming from like my whole life. Mm-hmm. Like everything that I had that was coming in through the drawing was being, oh my God, how am I going to program all that history and immediate sensory input and all those things into this machine? So that was really the wrong question, because it turned out that the influences on us as creative beings are enormous. They're basically an expression of sort of everything amalgamated that's going on in our lives up to that point. But it turned out also it was the right answer, because this kind of introspective work, this kind of looking for the source, looking for where thoughts arise, looking for where our self arises from, is really a kind of meditation. It's like an insight meditation. Mm-hmm. And so it was the right answer, because over the years I was doing daily many hours of insight meditation. And so the path of insight meditation, one of which is called Progressive Insight Path, which is in the Mahasi Sayadaw Theravada Buddhist tradition. As I've later found out, I was sort of following that, and I was sort of having the openings and the experiences that one might expect if one was spending, several hours a day doing insight meditation. And so when they got too big to ignore, then I had to go out and search out where that was coming from. And this is really what's happening, because that's how I'm holding my attention for that time. And because I was so engaged in the drawing, it was very good, very fluid meditation.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I mean, thinking a bit about the practices now you had in that chapter, I thought the marking practice itself was just a good introduction to kind of the way that you were going to have the practices be throughout the rest of the book. So maybe just talk a little bit about how that exercise was developed and what it is.
Right. Marking practice is really common in very, very beginner drawing classes. And the idea is to take a pencil or chalk or something like that and a piece of paper, maybe with some texture to it. Doesn't have to be. Can be anything. Can be the pen on your desk right now and the back of an envelope. But just in the marking practice, in just on the drawing side, you just make marks and you just kind of see what the pen does and see how it reacts to the paper. So you're just sort of drawing attention to the physicality of the materials. And with the mindfulness side, then you really process that. You really call attention to the senses. And so you're working two ways. One is that you're making marks that you're not attached to as representing anything or being art or having to be shown to anyone. You're just getting very casual at just putting scribbles down on paper. But at the same time, you're noticing that on the mindfulness side. You're starting to learn also to notice where that's coming from and what's coming. So, one of the stopping points, one of the hesitations that people have in doing drawing is they're really afraid of what it'll look like or what someone will say about it. There's doubt, there's fear, and there's this social convention. And so in the very beginning, I wanted to get past as much of that as I could, and just say, go back to when you were in kindergarten, when you had no idea about what you were going to do or what it meant. It was just fun. The waxy crayon on the construction paper, and you're just drawing like crazy. And so that's a fun time, I think. And so the mark making is a time when you can just go back and get into that sort of beginner mind mode. That's the place to start, because all throughout the book, I really want throughout all the exercises, I want people just to be able to work that freely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that worked very well. I definitely did it and enjoyed it. In the realistic drawing chapter, you talk about picking an object to draw practice, and you mentioned that the object is of secondary importance to how you see the object. What does that mean exactly?
One of the real common mistakes you see in beginning drawing is that you see a drawing that shows what the person thinks the object looks like versus what they actually see. And the one example is, if you ask people to draw a cup, like a coffee cup, you often see the top of it drawn as a circle, a flat circle on the page, because everybody knows the top of the cup is a circle. You see, but when we use our eyes and we sort of flatten the scene and just look at the shapes and the light and the textures that are there, you realize the top of the cup is actually an oval shape, because you're actually looking at it sort of at an angle. Mm-hmm. Usually you're not looking straight down at it. It's kind of at an angle. And so you just have to learn to really see the shapes that are being presented and not the shapes as you know them to be. So sometimes it's best, I do one exercise where we look at the space between objects. It's best to get away from these labels that we put on things, or the things that our mind shortcuts that we know about things. We know it happens in the mind that once you sort of get an idea about your surroundings, you sort of shortcut all the stuff and you don't pay attention. And there are these famous exercises where you're watching a video of people playing basketball and somebody in a gorilla suit walks by behind there, and because your mind has shortcut all that. And these exercises are to get you to start to open that up and slow down and look again. And so, so it should be a beautiful texture that you see, or an interesting outline that you see, more important than I'm going to draw a portrait of someone famous, or I'm going to draw this object that's meaningful to me. It's more about coming back into the senses.
Right. So it's about forcing yourself to actively kind of ping the outside world, as opposed to just referencing what you have in your mind.
It invites you to ping the outside world and open up to really what's happening. That's really one of the great beauties of drawing, is that if you take your time, you could be drawing the most banal still life scene, like Morandi, the Italian painter, drew the same sort of set of bottles and vases for years, but every one is kind of astounding, because he just looked in that moment. And it's not the bottles and the vases, it's the way the light came in the room that morning. It's that he was happy or sad that day. That's what's being conveyed. That sort of underlying thing is being conveyed. And so, just learning to look and see, despite, or whatever outside of meditation or any benefit, but just being able to re-engage the world is such a healthy thing.
Yeah. In the systematic drawing chapter, you have a practice to create a visual mantra, and you have people draw a circle, and then with an arrow over and over and over again. And so I was curious about why you chose a circle and how that drawing over and over again really can turn it into a mantra.
Right. Yeah. So I call it visual mantra, and there is a practice where which is long established, where people repeat syllables. People repeat a sound over and over again. It's the engagement with the sound that sort of takes away the thinking, selfing process in the mind, because there's some evidence to show that if we become engaged with two or more senses, that inner dialogue dies down.
Hmm.
And so in the mantra case, it's sort of the vibration of the throat and the ears, the hearing sense, so physical sense and the hearing sense. In the drawing, it's the kinesthetic, the hand motion sense, and the visual sense. So we are engaging these physical senses. And so by engaging these physical senses, the inner dialogue quiets down, and then we can sort of sit in awareness. Now, I chose the circle because of there's a Japanese calligraphy practice called enso, where the practitioner gets in a very quiet state of mind and then draws a circle, and sort of a perfect circle is reflected by a perfectly quiet mind. So I wanted to use that, but also I drew that symbol with the circle and the little arrow in the end spontaneously, even before I started the introspection process, when I was just drawing, just to get out the drawing energy. I would draw this, and for me, it was a diagram of what's the most special thing about us, which is this ability to know ourselves. And so this was a little diagram of self-awareness. So there's a little circle with an arrow on the end, and so we're constantly, am I okay? Am I okay? How's it going? Constantly checking on your own self, and constantly being awake and looking. That wakefulness is a self-consciousness. And so we draw this symbol, and it can call to mind this self-consciousness. So we can begin to look at our own awareness by drawing this symbol. If we read the symbol on that level, of course, if we're engaged with it physically and just doing it physically and just drawing it, that's enough. But if we are on a symbolic level and we're reading the symbol, we can remind ourselves that we should be aware of what's going on in our mind. That's another way of meditating. When in breath meditation, well, in lots of meditation, but let's say just if you're paying attention to the breath and your mind wanders, you bring yourself back to the breath. Or if you're focused on the feeling of the breath in the belly, wherever your attention is focused in a meditation and your mind wanders, you're asked to bring it back. And that's really a great basic meditation practice, is just to bring your attention back to the object of meditation. So in this case, the circle and the arrow are the object of meditation. And so you're drawing the circle, arrow, circle, arrow, circle, arrow. Your mind wanders. What's on TV tonight? Should I get Netflix, etc.? And then when you draw the little arrow part, I ask people, that's when you return. That's like the pointing you back. And so you draw, you draw, you draw. And then if your mind has wandered, use that arrowhead to bring yourself back to attention. Maybe it's back to the feeling of the pencil in your hand. Maybe it's the feeling of the pencil on the paper. Or maybe it's back to just this sitting in awareness sense that you're drawing this diagram of self-awareness. So there's a lot in that symbol that I've used for a long time. And the practice, of course, is not really mine. The mantra practice is quite old, but I've tried to adapt it to a visual arts arena, and in this case, it does. There's almost no for people who have a lot of hang up on the fear part, that people that have a lot of trouble deciding what to draw or worry about what the drawing will look like. The systematic drawing is a great practice, because you've already given them what it should look like, and doesn't have to be perfect. And then I give the practice in workshops, and some people draw the circle and arrow right beautifully in a line, and they get a beautiful grid of them. And some people are all over the page, and some people make them small and then large. It's really interesting to see.
Yeah.
Because I don't give a lot of specifics. I just say to draw it, and some people. So when we get to the drawings, you'll see that you can read a lot into that. But it's also very liberating, I think, for people, because there's no expectation about what it should look like. It's really a kind of a mindful doodle in the very simplest sense, but it has all the elements of meditation in it.
Yeah. I'll say that mine was definitely more of the sort of chaotic circles all over the place as opposed to orderly. And I'm sure that says much about me. but I enjoyed the exercise and completely just covered a big page I had. So the book describes sort of the natural dialogue that arose between conceptual art and contemplative practice. And so I was wondering if you could tell me what that dialogue is and kind of how that influenced your work and the book itself.
Yeah, there are a lot of crossovers in art history with meditation and also with Buddhist practice, especially in the 50s and 60s and the Beat generation. And one artist who particularly bridged that consciously and knowingly and did amazing work that way was Yoko Ono. And I use a couple of her examples in the book. And she was one of the great influences on conceptual art. And she was using a style that was very similar to a Zen koan, if you know what those are. They're like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And it's a question that's meant to confound you in a way that throws you back out of your own logical reasoning mind, that moment of creativity that we were talking about, it turns you to that, or turns you into that space really sort of quickly. That's the only way out of a question like that, is to sort of see it more broadly. And she was using that sort of style to make little exercises in the 1960s and publishing them as conceptual art. Well, it just happened that in New York at that time, there were a number of artists working that way. And the idea, an idea or the idea was the art itself. And it corresponds in a really interesting way to the rise of cybernetics in society, because IBM was becoming a really important thing, and engineering was taking a great role in putting people on the moon, and we were seeing computers in images of science and engineering, and computers were getting more and more used and more affordable, and they're all based on these sort of sets of instructions. And so the artists also were systematizing their approach to art. And so that was really great feeding ground for an artist in the 1980s and 90s like me, who wanted to work with computers and see where the connections were with art. There was a show at the Museum of Modern Art and another at the Jewish Museum that were about information and software in the 1960s. So it was definitely in the public eye. It was in the air, and there were a number of artists. Also, Sol LeWitt, who I talk about in the book, developed the wall drawing, and he essentially wrote an algorithm, wrote a little program, and he didn't do the drawings. He gave them to someone, which was, in my case, the equivalent of giving them to a machine. But he gave them to a person and would say all horizontal, vertical, and diagonal line combinations. And they would draw the squares on the wall, and they would do all the line combinations. So it's a little piece of software. And so when I started to do my software art, I was drawing from these conceptual artists and automating the instructions to make my drawings on the screen. At the same time, it seemed to me that it's really, really interesting that the artwork was a concept, that the artwork was in the mind. And I wanted to see if there were different locations, if the analytical mind if there was a certain kind of art that could be focused to the analytical mind or appeal to the analytical mind, or if there's a certain kind of art that could be, that would appeal to the sensory receptors of the mind. And it's true that you can look at art and you can see sort of where it's positioned, where it's poised. So there seemed to be a natural affinity between artists that were working with concepts and ideas, mental things, and practitioners who were also examining the contents of the mind.
That's really interesting. So
I made some discussion about what I felt were the strong crossovers there, and it did. The funny thing for me was that it did mix up with the computer at some point where I had come from. So it was almost all like art and artificial intelligence and computers, but also mindfulness. And there's a real question of what mind is, and it's always been a question, I think, and it's only getting more interesting. And even if machines do never become mind, what they have shown us about mind is really, really something important.
Yeah, the idea of consciousness and what is that? And I just started reading the book. What is it? Consciousness and the Social Brain. I don't know if you're familiar, but the guy is sort of, it's the same. I think he's trying to think through, okay, what is consciousness? He describes kind of the easy, hard problem version and trying to think through it all. And Yeah, it's kind of amazing to think about that we could understand what's happening in our brains at such a deep level, but still not understand how it happens. But
Yeah, and it's almost like if you were to study the radio and you could understand how the signal is taken and amplified and put out the speaker, but you still didn't know where the waves were coming from.
right, yeah, it's like there's this key part that we still don't know, and a lot of people think we may never know. Interestingly,
That's another great question, and that was true in the software. How could a set of rules that are meant to just follow this set of instructions ever get outside of itself? How could it ever do something that was not in the set of rules? This was one of the major obstacles to writing an artificial creative AI. Was that it the only way to get it out of the rules was to write rules that described how it would get out, and that would be then the only way it could get
yeah,
out. So the creator is never separate from the creation. I also learned that from it, and then it gave me. In the beginning, I saw myself writing software programs that would be the computer doing the art, but in the end, I realized it will never be anything but my own work.
mm,
So I'm implicated as an artist in everything, and it gave me much more responsibility for the thing I created. Given that there are like so many possible ways of creating work and so many possible outcomes, which are the ones I'm creating? That's describing who I am in a really accurate way.
right. Well, we'll get to that in a second, and I think the reading the
Right.
drawings. But for the next chapter in improvisational drawing, you talk about how improvisation needs boundaries. And I actually used to teach improv comedy, and it's the same idea. It's starting a scene from a complete blank is very difficult. So if you can establish things like who are you to each other, where are you, those things very quickly, then within that framework you can really start to enjoy yourself when you're improvising. So I think, and you talk about the same thing here, is that because improvisation needs boundaries, our choices of materials and methods are as equally important as the composition or subject matter. And so I was curious if you had a particular story, or if you could tell me about a time when your materials and methods kind of led you down a surprising path.
Though so many times, when I feel like I've just exhausted creative possibility, immediately I change. So I've had these pencils that are made of also watercolor material,
Mm-hmm.
and made lines and then poured water or dripped water. And then in the very beginning, when I started working with ink on paper, I would just throw the ink down on the paper and then I just blow like air from my mouth across it, and it would like splay out in very interesting ways. And I got very comfortable with that. And then I changed paper and it wouldn't do it, you
Oh
see.
no.
Oh, huh, interesting. It's a whole kind of different world that emerged. So that's all surprising. You think you understand the properties, and then it sort of also changes. And to relate it to the improv comedy, understand there's a rule in improv that you never say no. That it's always yes and something like that to
Yeah,
keep the
yeah. It's
scene
generally like you
scene
want to, I mean, you
going.
can say the word no if it makes sense, but you generally want to accept the reality of the situation. So if I called you my grandmother, you wouldn't want to say, "Oh no, I'm actually your father," right? Because that's then
Right.
denying the reality that I had created.
I would say yes. I would say, yes, grandson. Have you taken out the
Right,
trash?
exactly.
So in drawing, it's especially improvisational drawing, it's great to go with it that way, and not to criticize and go back and say, was that a good move? Should I have done that? Does this look good? But just like you make that mark and you make another mark and you make another mark and you watch the thing grow, and that's really interesting and hard thing to learn to do. You put aside the fear and you put aside the self critic, and you let it grow. Yeah. So I worked all the way up to very large um, sculptural works that go on the wall. And what I do now is that I finish more or less all of the technical details of it, how it's made, the priming and the coloring and the shaping and the sanding and all that. And then the very last thing I do with many of these works is that I go back with the hand and I work on it that way. And so I have to be absolutely in that open state, improvisational state, accepting what's coming along and watching it. And so one of the very big pieces I did was there was a kind of a head, and there was a frame broken behind it, and it was sort of a model of consciousness. And I wanted to do this very Zen-like brushwork, and I practiced and I practiced. But when I got to doing it, I had a little too much ink on the brush, and then it was dripping a little bit. And I was like, I could see the tightening coming, but I let it go. And then in the end, it was perfect. It's exactly, the dripping was exactly where it should have been. It ended up where it should have been. But you can never, all the time you work on the big pieces, it's like it's new, because you can never really practice that much on that finished work. So you practice on smaller and smaller. But like I say, when the surface is different, you never really know 100% what's going to happen.
And it worked
And
out
that
for you.
it worked out beautifully. And I think that you can see in the work the edginess that you can see in there, the flow and the hesitation and the conclusion. All It's impossible to hide it in the line. If you draw a line across a piece of paper and you slow down and speed up, the graphite thickens and thins in different ways. So it's so revealing. Yeah, always surprising in a certain way, always surprising what the materials will bring.
Yeah. So you had a couple great practices. I think I want to focus on the universe one. I really thought that
Okay.
that particular one was pretty powerful, and I love the way that you described it in the book. So maybe tell everyone what that particular one is and how you developed it.
Okay, and I should also say, like, we're talking about these three chapters that are in the middle, the realistic drawing,
Hmm.
systematic drawing, and improvisational drawing, and each one contains several practices, three or four practices. And I ask everybody, like, to try it all. I think it's really good to try them all, but I don't expect everybody to do all of them all the time. But what I hope is that you'll find the style, if you like to render, or if you like to systematize, if it's easier just to have a symbol to repeat or whatever, or if you're comfortable being open. Just the same with meditation. Like, some people like to do concentration practice, and some people like to do insight practice, and some people are good with mantra. So I hope people will find one that really resonates with them, that's the one that really works for me, and that's the one you sort of spend some time and do some in-depth work on. Okay, so the universe drawing you. it's It starts off very broadly, in imagining, like, what this moment is and how we got to this moment, and how I mean, there's a lot of stories, a lot of creation stories, and that's a whole kind of area of research that I more or less had to leave out of the book, but I've spent a lot of time on, which is that every culture has a creation story, where we came from, whether it's Adam and Eve, or a world tree, or arising from the ocean, or how did this moment come to be? And in scientific studies, there's a big bang. We don't really know how it happened. We don't know really if there was anything before. But let's say there was a big bang, and energy came into the universe, and then matter condensed, and then from that there were stars, and then from that all that molecules of the stars blew up, and then more stars formed and planets formed. So all the particles that are on the planet uh, were at one time part of that star-making ecosystem, and then all the molecules in our body came all from that as well. So I guess people that really think through the history of their being, and just bring it all the way down to this moment, like, how could it be that we're sitting here right now with this pencil in our hand, and all of a sudden we put this mark down on the paper, and that's part of that story. That's like one more moment in that universal story. And the fact that we're here with this kind of paper and this kind of building with this pencil is really the record of all that. So your drawing, in some way, is the natural, evolutionary, systematic result of all this that's happened before. That this moment is just a representation, and this drawing is just a representation of that moment. And then you draw that, and it becomes part of that record, becomes part of that past. So I try to bring people to see that sort of pointedness of the moment, based on everything. Like the whole universe has sort of evolved. Your whole life has evolved, and man has evolved, and society's evolved, and the idea of drawing has evolved from all these histories. And so you can just kind of let go and just let this thing draw, let it draw. That what's coming out is really the natural course of all the things that have brought it to be.
Yeah.
So it's
And that, which I thought was just amazing, right? It's such a great way of thinking through everything that's come before us and how we're connected to the rest of the universe. And I think that's, yeah, I think that was
There's
interesting
a
for me.
moment in flow in drawing when the artist has a sense, and I've had this many times, that it's not you in there drawing, but you're just more or less a vehicle. You're some sort of vessel for this energy that's coming through.
Right.
And that's a really great place to draw as well. And it's a great place to be able to step aside and let the drawing flow, especially in improvisational drawing, and just let it flow and just say the physics and mechanics that have made this room this temperature and have made my arm as strong as it is and has made the paper appear here from the store where I bought it. And it's all those things have conspired to make this thing happen. And I always say when you make that pencil touch the paper and it makes that mark, right? That's the moment. That's the moment the whole universe of that drawing starts. So you're talking about in improvisation, how you have a setting and you get started, a little premise. And so when you make that first mark, you've made the first mark of that drawing, but you've also eliminated absolutely every other drawing that doesn't have that mark, which is many more drawings than you can make.
Right.
So every time you make a mark, you're making more and more specific what you've done, and you're more and more narrowing it down and more eliminating all the other possibilities of what that could be. And that's also another great point of view to sit at and say, oh, it was really, this is the drawing that just happens to have occurred at this time.
Sure. And yeah, and so to get into the reading the drawings part, the reading the drawings chapter, and we kind of alluded to this a couple times already, but you wrote drawings are portraits of the person who makes them. And to connect with, what we were saying earlier about how the drawings can say a lot about you. So I'm just curious what you mean about that.
Yeah, it's the same with what I was saying about the line pressure is the record of where the hand went. And there's a saying in the art school, like there's no portrait that's not a self-portrait. There's no drawing that's not a self-portrait, because of all those decisions that you make about what it should be made of and what it should look like and what the point of view should be and what the shading should be, and all those things are really revealing drawings you've seen in pictures in the past that you want to imitate, and places where you want to change that, and places where you have a good technique, and places where you want to avoid because you don't do hands and eyes well, this kind of thing. So when I look at an artwork from someone, I'm really seeing deeply into this long set of decisions that they've made, and I think that's portraiture. That's really a great picture of who they are. And so when we read the drawings, I have people do a long description of what they're seeing, what they're actually seeing, and then the stories they tell about it. And it's all in a way to get to see the deep stories that we tell all the time about ourselves and how we construct our identity based on these stories. And part of what happens in meditation when you go deeply is that you see those identities as stories and you be able to let them go. And a lot of suffering comes from I'm this kind of person, and he said this to me, and I'm insulted by that. So, because we keep such a story, we can become affronted or offended or what have you because of something, but only because we think of ourselves a certain way. Also, when we hold expectations, what a drawing should look like, and then it doesn't look like that, or we think I expected that I would be first in line and I wasn't, and we suffer again. So it's also seeing what stories are contributing to that suffering and being able to let that go. This is a way to sort of spread those stories out without sort of directly having to say them. We indirectly or non-verbally say them by just making a drawing. We do the drawing as freely as possible, and then we can read those stories out of them.
Yeah, so to really, that's a great point, and to kind of make that point explicit in the book, you talk about a personal story and about how there was a time when drawing helped you work through a moment of grief in your life. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I will. So I found myself making these drawings that were trees that had been cut down, or stumps of trees. And this is the story you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I constructed a huge story about I'm going to be this kind of environmental artist. Because this is what was coming up. And I had an experience at Boy Scout camp when I was younger, where I'd gone to this camp for many years, And the land for the camp had been donated by a paper company, and it was beautiful pine forest. And we camped there many years. And then toward the end of the time that I was a scout, maybe when I was 17 or 18, I went to the camp one summer to work, and the land all around it, except for a very small area where the actual camp proper was, had been clear cut for the paper company. They'd taken all the wood, and I was shocked by that. And so when these drawings started to come up of these barren landscapes and these stumps, I was sure that I was reacting to that. And I made a lot of story and analysis of myself as an environmental artist, and I told it for a long time. But previous to those drawings coming up, I had lost a cousin of mine who was very young, and she was very close to me, and she was the one in the family who had been an artist first and had made it okay to be an artist. And it wasn't until I started to see and to read into those drawings, because I kept making them and they kept being different and strange, and I kept questioning whether the environmental story was the right one. What I saw was that this tree stump and this cut down tree was a symbol for her life ending prematurely at a young age, and so to sort of cut down in her prime, as it were. And when I saw the reason that I think that I resonated with that was that when I saw that, when I was able to admit to myself that the drawings I made in the year following her death about the trees were a part of the grieving process, when I sort of came to understand that that was the symbol that I had been unconsciously bringing up and using, it sort of let go. It became easier, and it was a kind of a deep understanding, like, I see, I can see that. So not to say that I wasn't reacting to the clear cutting, and that not that that wasn't an important symbol. Like I say, drawing comes from all over. Like, our influences and our creativity come from all over, and they could be simultaneously resonant, that the feeling of loss of the trees and the feeling of loss of this very close family member could have resonated strongly enough to bring it up enough to make it present in the drawing and make it appear in the drawing. And so I was able to see how deeply our symbology represents those kind of unspoken or unspeakable things in our lives, that the grief was so tremendous, it was paralyzing for a while from this loss, and it was just unable to express it. I finally found this way to express it. And then maybe there were 2 or 3 more drawings out of habit of the trees, and then that symbol just kind of stopped appearing, and other symbols started to appear in the drawings. And that made me think, I see, like, reading the drawings and getting into the depth of what they're about is a kind of a psychological unburdening process that can take place. And it's a way of seeing and introspecting. I mean, there's part of our brain that speaks and understands words and reasons and does logic, but there's another part of our brain that processes images, and there's a lot of evidence to show that it has its own kind of agenda and separate sets of thoughts and its own things that it needs to express. But how does the nonverbal part of the brain talk? How does it get it? It can't. Sometimes it can transmit a message over to the words, or it can be a gut feeling, or it can be an emotion. A lot of times, strong nonverbal feelings come out in lots of ways. So I found that in doing the spontaneous improvisational drawing, the nonverbal can have a voice.
Yeah, and I thought that was just such a great example that you told in the book, and very powerful. So thanks for sharing. In the Search for the Source of Creativity chapter, you talk about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and how that relates to artists. So maybe if you could explain what that hero's journey is, and how you kind of felt it connected with art specifically.
Yeah, I give 2 big models, and because I had a background in geology, I'm big on modeling and I'm big on maps, and I love other people that make maps. And in that chapter, I give 2 big models for the artistic journey, and one is kind of an exterior, outward journey, and that's the hero's journey, and then the ox drawing is kind of the inward journey. So, in Joseph Campbell's classic hero's journey, which you see in classes on theater, and you see in classes on filmmaking, and classes on storytelling, and classes on novel writing, because it's a really good map of a experience that many people share, which is that the hero or the creative, or however you want to say, the person that wants to venture outside of the norm, outside of the ordinary, has certain milestones that he crosses. And the milestones map pretty well to working creatively, especially in the outside world. And for instance, when the hero decides to leave the norm, okay, the creative person, for instance, or the heroic person has to leave home, has to, the village is settled, but the enemy's over there, or this is all the stuff I know. I want to find something I don't know. I want to stand out in a way. You cross this threshold. So the first place is the threshold, and there are these demons on the threshold. And in art, the demons are fear and doubt and social convention. I mentioned them before. Yeah, so you have to overcome those. And when you sit down to draw, they're there. When I sit down after 17, 18 years, immediately they're there. They're my little friends now, but they don't go away, because there's always this moment of hesitation of what's going to happen when you cross the threshold, when you're about to make that mark. Sometimes you blow through, sometimes they hold you up for a while. And then the hero goes out onto this journey, whether it's in the Iliad, going out and in trying to make some discovery, classic hero tales, or whether it's just you doodling on a piece of paper. You go out and there's the unknown. You're in the unknown, and you're working in the unknown. And the idea is that you work through the unknown until you just make a discovery. And in the hero journey case, the gods, you snatch fire from the gods, or you grab wisdom from someplace, or you find a treasure in the sand, however it works. Mm-hmm. And you find something that no one has seen before, or you've seen for the first time, and then after that you turn and you go to bring it back, and you want to bring it back, and then you go through many more trials of trying to get back and trying to reintegrate what you've discovered into the world. So you go out and you find out that if you blow on ink, it makes these amazing branching structures, but how to get other people to see exactly the beauty in that, how to frame that, how to bring it into the world and put it in a place where people can see it in the right context. So the end of the hero's journey is coming back and reintegrating into the world, and getting your work out there and showing your work. So you want to go out, make a discovery, kill a monster, steal wisdom from the gods, and you come back a hero with something that the culture has never seen before.
Sure. And then, yeah, maybe talk about the internal side, the ox herding.
Right. So that's all. And the beginning was what I did in my early art career, which was to go out and make work and get it accepted and get it into museums, and the conquering attitude. But then I came to a place where, internally, I was not feeling fulfilled. Like I really didn't know where the source of that creativity was. Like I could figure out how to get to the gods, like Mondrian and Joseph Albers and these great artists, and to take from them and to bring it back into the world where people will recognize it and get recognition myself for it. But really, where was the motivation coming from? Like, where was the source of my own creativity? And the map for that I found in many places, but the beautiful visual map can be found in what's known as the 10 Zen ox herding pictures. There's other names for them, but some people know them as the ox herding pictures. And they've been around for hundreds of years. And they're simply little kind of illustrations of the stages of the path to enlightenment. And there are little poems that go with them. And it's also been kind of a tradition among artists to redraw and rewrite these little stories. And so I took that exercise on myself to make my own version, and not centered necessarily on the path of enlightenment, although as a deeper reading it's still there, but as the creative path, because it mirrors it. Let's just say it echoes it so well. It's the steps in the creative practice where ideas come from, and the steps in the practice of getting to enlightenment seem to resonate really well. And so they go through 10 phases, beginning with just the idea that, like curiosity, like the idea that you want to do something. Say you put things in your room, you put your bookshelf and your sofa and your chair in your room, but that's not right. They need to be over here. There's a sense already that things should be a certain way. Mm-hmm. That's where it begins. Like just with that sense that things should be a certain way, or things aren't quite the way you want them, and why. So there's this curiosity. What if I do it this way? What if I do it that way? What if I make marks on paper? So it begins with curiosity, and then you start to look at and evaluate the things you're drawing, and then you kind of catch a glimpse of something. You catch a glimpse of the style that you want to work in, or you find you're talented at this one little aspect, and so it begins you on the path. And this happens in the spiritual practice there's a longing. There's either something missing that you want or something that's there that you don't want. You're suffering, you don't want to suffer, or you want greater happiness, or you want greater fulfillment in life. And so you sort of start down that path, and you begin to meditate. In the beginning, you don't quite know what's going on. You're making art. You don't really know what you're doing yet. And then it starts to grow because you practice. Whether you practice meditation or whether you practice art, if you do something directed, especially with a good teacher, day to day, it grows. You start to get better at it. And this is what the path describes, which is why it's so good. It seems to really know what happens. So you catch a glimpse of the ox, and then you catch him by the tail. And that's when you get hooked. You start to paint, and then you start to love it. And then you have to decide if it's really for real. Is this something for me? Am I going to spend my time on this, or am I going to let it go? And you get hooked. And then you have to tame the ox, and that's the work, and that takes a lot of time. I'm into meditation, but now I've got to actually learn to sit, and I've got to really practice every day, and I've got to really get my concentration up. Or I'm going to paint, I've got to really take some technique, and the taming takes a while. And then you get to the riding, and of course all these things happen on a daily scale and a weekly scale and a monthly, and they take years. It's because they're little cycles. So you make a drawing and you get good at something and you ride it a little bit, you tame it, and then it's done, and then you go back and you go back. So you're in the taming phase, you get better at it, and then you get to the riding phase, and then you have techniques that you like, but then you understand that you're just repeating yourself, so you have to go back and start again. And then you start to get deeper and deeper understanding. So stages 7, 8, 9 and are the deeper understanding stages, when you start to see who it is that's desiring to make the drawing and how the drawing and you are really part of the same process as we're describing with the universe. You're really just part of that whole process. And so the egoistic self, the tight self-identifying self, starts to open up, and you sort of see your connections and the connections of what you're doing to the whole world around you. And then the end, and then the stage 9 is sitting at the source. So then that's surprisingly called sitting at the source to me, who was always looking for the source of creativity. But then it's the source of your own nature, the source of consciousness in the universe. But it's also the source of everything. So it's the source of your creative work. It's the source of the building you are sitting in. It's the source of your chair. And then the 10th stage is the return to the market, which is kind of similar to Joseph Campbell's hero journey, is that you go back and you integrate, and then you come back from that experience, whether it be just one drawing, one meditation, and then come back. If you really go into meditation just one day and you sit for half an hour and you come back, the world seems a little bit different, a little bit changed after you've had that experience. That's true on a small scale, and it's true on a large scale. And so at the end you return to the world and you integrate what you've learned back into the world around you. So that's more the inner journey.
Sure. Yeah, and it's a good point that they're both important and useful to understand. So in the last chapter in the book, Meta Drawing, you get to maybe the scariest of all for a lot of people, which is the sharing portion. And so you talk about sharing with yourself, sharing with a good friend, and sharing with the public. And I was curious about, in terms of the friend, I mean, what's the ideal artist friend like, and how are we going to find that person?
Yeah, it's a great question. Great question. And the same thing happens in the meditation circles. They call Dharma friends sometimes. And if you know anything about Buddhist practice, you know that there are 3 jewels, which is the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the Sangha, which is the community of other meditators, is so important. It's considered one of the 3 jewels. And in the art world, it's the same. The art community, the supporting community, probably in any social situation, the community is so important. And how do you find the person or the group that you can share with? And it's an intuitive quest. Practically, if people are interested in drawing friends, what I'd say is we have a group on Facebook and on Google Plus for Drawing Your Own Path, where people share their drawings. It's a small, it's a closed group, and people share their drawings. But there are actually many groups on these social networks, which is an interesting place. Besides that, in my local, very tiny little town here in upstate New York, there's a little group that shares and critiques work, physically. So I would say that these groups are all around, whether it's improvisational comedy or drawing or dance or what have you, meditation or whatever. And I feel like if you make creative work, if you do anything creative, the sharing part is so vital, and it's really easy not to do that. It's really easy not to take it seriously enough or to think enough about it. And all I say is, at that point, look at what's holding you back. Look at that. Take a moment and be mindful of that fear that's holding it back. That's really the place that deserves to open up, because it's some kind of image of self, as we were talking about, that's being represented. I'm not good enough. I don't deserve it. This kind of thing that should be examined. Yeah, and what should the person be like? Well, in Drawing Your Own Path, I say that we're not about critique. Like, there's a lot. If you go to art school, it's about formal critique, and it's about how you could make the drawing better, or how it could be more commercial, or what materials you use. And it's not really about that for us. It's really the best way to share, as described by John Dado Laurie in his Zen of Creativity. The best way to share is to look and just to tell the person, or just to share with the person, what is coming up. If you're even familiar at all with that level of meditation, just what feelings or what emotions are coming up. How does it make you feel? So not a lot of critique, formal critique you get from other artists is about how they would change the drawing to make it sort of more like what they'd like to see. And this isn't about that at all. It's really just in the moment, looking at a thing and saying what's coming up in the moment. So I would say that would be a quality you'd look for in another person who you want to share with. And in these communities, if they're sensitive to the mindfulness and creativity, hopefully that's the kind of feedback you're going to get. And I'd say it's intuitive, and maybe it's just like dating. You have to see if you have rapport, with people. See if you get along with people, and see if you have a resonance with that community. I make a lot of work in the studio, and I make a lot of work in private, and I'm by myself for many hours a day. And I develop works, even large works, for a long time that never get seen by anybody else. And it's just a conviction I have. It's a superstition I have. But when a work is seen by someone, it changes the work. Now, whether that's just in my mind or whether there's some physical thing going on, probably it's just in my mind. But once a work is seen, it changes, and that change is important. It brings a kind of, like, if you know the quantum mechanical idea of collapsing the waveform. Sure. When something's seen, like Schrodinger's cat is alive or dead. You get to that point where it's what's coming up for someone else. So someone else has observed it's alive or dead.
Yeah.
You've closed that waveform on it, and it changes it. And I think that's really critical. And that's why putting drawings up every day online is a really nice thing, because we close the waveform on that, and people get to know us, and they know our proclivities, and then discussion arises from that. And you're telling people a lot of things by what you share.
Sure. So that kind of wraps it up for the book. I mean, are there any other lessons or takeaways you hoped people would get that we haven't covered?
Well, I think we covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we sure did.
The main thing is that I was a very frustrated person in my life until I allowed myself creative outlet, and I always feel that it's very healthy. And so, no matter what it is, if your creative vessel is giving, if your creative vessel is serving, if your creative vessel is making, whatever it turns out that you like to do creatively, whether you're facilitating or whether you're building or whatever you're doing, I think that that's a really healthy thing for people. And I think that my greatest source of fulfillment has been when I allow myself to be as open creatively as I can. So hopefully this book will facilitate that for some people.
Yeah, well, it definitely did for me. I love doing all the different exercises and working through them. So it's a pleasure to read. And so I think we'll just move on to the thunder round. I'll ask you a couple quick fun questions, and we'll call it a day. How's that sound?
Okay, sounds amazing. And thank you, by the way. And it was quite obvious that you read it and did the exercises, which is amazing. So I appreciate you being so prepared and professional about this.
Yeah. Well, I really liked the book and I really liked the exercises. It was great. I mean, I took like one drawing class forever ago, but I think I had many of the issues, that a lot of people do. So it
Right.
was
And I
helpful.
think if you draw, I'm not saying even if you don't draw every day, but if you just find yourself doodling, if you just bring that little bit of mindfulness to it, just a little bit more awareness to that moment, I think you'll see it open.
Sure.
It's a great experience.
Sure. So first thunder round question is, what's your favorite food or drink?
Yeah, I thought about this quite a bit, and I like lots of food. I like lots
Right.
of food, but I grew up in South Louisiana, and I was just there visiting my folks, and I think boiled crawfish is really one of the great foods of the
There it
world.
is. Yeah. And so maybe you just answer this question, but what's your favorite place you've ever been?
Well, I like Louisiana, and I grew up there, and the food is good. New Orleans, especially, I was just there as well. But also, my wife is from Hawaii, and I've
Mm.
spent some time on the windward side of Oahu around Kailua, and it's another really unique place, really amazing
Yeah.
place where you're just out in the surf and the sun.
Yeah. Hawaii's amazing. And so, yeah, here's the last one, and I like this question. What if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing? What would it be and why?
So yeah, I gave this one a lot of thought too, and what came up for me was that I would remove politics from food distribution,
Mm.
because the thing that really bothers me the most is that we have so much, and there are people without food, and there's lots of other material things, but food is food and water even, I would say that political boundaries and exchange should be eliminated in the cases where people really are in need, and we should just use the abundance that we have to give the basics of food and water to everyone without reserve.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree, and that's a very powerful thought. So thank you for thinking through that. I think that's a great way to end. And so I will say again, thanks so much, John F. Simon, for being with me. The book is Drawing Your Own Path, 33 Practices at the Crossroads of Art and Meditation, and I heartily recommend it. Thanks again, John.
Thank you, John, so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.